This is Word on the Reef, where marine science meets adventure. Join Tanya Murphy and Brett Goodban as we plunge into the wonders of the Great Barrier Reef and explore the mysteries beneath the waves. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Word on the Reef. I'm your host, Tanya Murphy, and joining me, as always, is fellow ocean adventurer Brett Goodban.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Brett, and happy Easter to everyone tuning in. It's Good Friday today. Brett, any plans for the long weekend?
Probably after the busy week, a lot of rest, I think. Yeah.
That might be the case for a lot of people.
Oh, and chocolate.
Absolutely. Yes, essential. I'm going camping tomorrow for a couple of days, so I'm looking forward to that, especially because the weather's taken a bit of a cooler turn, which might make camping a bit more comfortable. But sadly, this cool change has come a bit too late for the Great Barrier Reef. This week, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority confirmed what many of us were already seeing in the water. The reef is experiencing its sixth mass coral bleaching event in just 9 years. We've heard it from multiple guests on the show in recent weeks. I saw it myself on my most recent dive near Cairns during my birthday. Shallow water corals are bleaching and glowing fluorescent in front of our eyes. It's heartbreaking, and it's happening. But now it's been made official. In an email to subscribers on Wednesday, the Reef Authority confirmed that this bleaching event stretches more than 1,000 kilometres from Townsville all the way up to the Torres Strait, the sixth mass bleaching event in just 9 years. This is only the second time in history that we've seen a mass bleaching across consecutive summers from 2016 to 2017 and now 2024 to 2025. 2 summers in a row last year and this year. Our reef simply isn't getting the time it needs to recover.
No.
So, Brett, as someone who lives and breathes all things reef, how does it feel to hear about this 6 mass bleaching event in 9 years?
Oh, it's just awful, isn't it? You almost feel like you're a little bit, you're letting the animals and the reef down, you know, because it's part of our life and it's who we are and we have a connection with it. And when we see that happening, it's just really, really hard. We need to do better for them.
It is hard.
Yep.
Now, we know that what's happening this year is also unprecedented on multiple fronts. On last week's show, Professor Zoe Richards joined us and told us that both of Australia's World Heritage listed reefs, Western Australia's Ningaloo Reef and the Great Barrier Reef, are both bleaching at the same time for the first time ever that we know of. And the week before on our show, Dr. David Abrego from Lizard Island Research Station said they've now experienced 6 bleaching events in the last 6 years. So it's literally annual up there. And by the way, everyone, if you did miss those episodes, you can catch up anytime online at Word on the Reef on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, this bleaching is not just affecting Australia. According to the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the entire planet is in the grips of a 2-year global bleaching event, the worst ever recorded, affecting nearly 84% of reef regions in at least 82 countries. Now, Australia's Reef Authority says this bleaching is being driven by prolonged above-average ocean temperatures, with climate change the biggest threat to coral reefs worldwide. But what's most shocking could be the lack of response. This is an underwater national emergency, the equivalent of a bushfire stretching from Townsville to the Torres Strait.
Wow, that's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, but instead of sounding the alarm, as you would if your house was on fire, the Reef Authority just kind of slipped it into an email, which is only read by nerdy people like me who subscribe to science updates. And it was picked up by some sections of the media, but where's the sense of urgency? Where's the national outrage? Well, that's where we come in on our show to talk more about what's happening and bring it a little bit more into the spotlight. So later in the show, we'll be joined by Simon Miller from the Australian Marine Conservation Society. And he'll help us unpack what this bleaching event means and what we can all do about it. So stay tuned. But before we do, let's talk about the other big thing coming up.
Oh, yes.
The F word, federal election or E-word election. Australians head to the polls in just 2 weeks, Saturday the 3rd of May, and early voting opens Tuesday, so just a few days away. So Have you decided about who you're voting for, Brett? Now, you don't need to tell us exactly who, but have you decided?
Oh, yeah. I've spoken to the fish. I have the VIP phone call for them, so I'm going to vote for them this year for sure. Yeah, definitely.
You've consulted the fish.
I have spoken to them out there. We had a big meeting the other day, and the ones at the aquariums, and they've all told me that that's what they need, so that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, I get the feeling that there are some politicians that the fish would be a little bit cranky with.
Oh, I wouldn't let the fish near them. It'd be ugly.
So some are calling this election the Reef's last real chance, because if we don't cut emissions this decade, we might not get another shot in time. The decisions made in the next term of government, especially on climate targets and speeding up the transition to renewables, will decide the future of the Great Barrier Reef. So if you're wondering who's offering the strongest action in terms of the political parties, we get this question a lot, people asking us.
Yeah, that's right, all the time at the moment, which is good.
Who should we vote for? Which... that's up to the individual, but you need to do your research, especially on what each party is really going to do about climate change and renewable energy if you want to help protect the reef. So I recommend that anyone out there who wants to know, check out the Climate Council's website and especially their election scorecard. It is non-partisan and science-based. What they've done is analyse all the policy announcements and commitments of the major parties and rated them on how they will impact the climate and, by extension, our environment. So according to that scorecard, here's how the major parties stack up. The Liberal National Coalition's policies are rated as harmful to the climate. The Australian Labor Party's policies are rated as heading in the right direction, but I guess room for improvement is implied there. The Australian Greens are rated as having strong climate policies according to this scorecard. So those aren't my opinions. I'm just reading out the policies and the science from the Climate Council's website, and you can read the full breakdown, which goes into full detail about all those parties' policies on climate and where they stand on the various aspects of climate action. So just Google that if you'd like to know where the parties stand before you head to the polls. But we also know that some parties have openly stated, like One Nation and Family First, that they want to scrap climate targets and climate action altogether, just like Trump has done in the US, which, what do you think that would spell for our reef, Brett, if we were to scrap climate action?
Oh, look, I don't even want to think about it. It's awful, just awful.
And not only for the reef, but for communities who depend
everywhere. Yeah,
on a safe...
And 16% of all marine life on planet Earth as well. Let's not forget that. Plus the coral, plus the EAC that feeds our reef and our rainforest, the oldest rainforest on the planet. I mean, it's right there in front of you. Yeah.
Well, as we've discussed on some of our previous shows, imagine if all the animals on the reef could vote. Who would they be voting for? Oh. Now... there's been a lot of commentary about the ABC Leaders debate, which was on Wednesday night, where Labor Prime Minister Anthony Albanese faced off with Liberal opposition leader Peter Dutton. When asked if the impacts of climate change are already happening, Dutton said there's an impact, but when asked to confirm if climate change is happening right now, he replied, "I don't know, and I'm not a scientist." Brett, you watched the debate. How did that land with you?
I was in shock. Actually, I just couldn't believe that that someone that wants to try and run our beautiful country, that's the largest coral reef on planet Earth and the oldest rainforest on planet Earth and the most incredible diversity, you can see it happening. I mean, it's just so obvious. But, he has said that he will listen to the scientists, and everyone needs to remember out there, they're scientists for a reason. They're not Kevin on Facebook that told you at the pub. They're scientists. They know what they're doing. They've worked hard. They're the people that we listen to guide us in the right direction to protect this natural wonder. So I was gobsmacked. I nearly dropped my Weet-Bix bowl. I couldn't believe it.
Well, that would have ruined your new couch, wouldn't it?
Terrible.
So what's interesting is that earlier that same day, I attended a forum right here in Cairns where both major Leichhardt candidates, the Labor and Liberal candidates, acknowledged that climate change is real, human-induced, and already harming the reef. So it would appear that they have researched the topic more in depth, especially since the reef is so important here in Queensland. And polls consistently show that the majority of Australians, including voters from all ends of the political spectrum, are concerned about climate change and want to see stronger government action on climate change and to protect the Great Barrier Reef. So hopefully Peter Dutton will listen to his constituents, especially in his home state of Queensland and in marginal seats like Leichhardt, where the economy depends on a healthy reef. And locals here are already feeling the impacts of floods, heat waves, and not to mention rising insurance premiums if you want to talk about the cost of living, all worsened by climate change.
I think that's important, just quick, I think that's really important, is that remembering that Cairns survives on its tourism, its farming and tourism. In both aspects of that could suffer dramatically. So we love this city we live in. We love being able to go out to this beautiful natural wonder. We love living in the tropics. So why wouldn't we want to vote for someone that saves it? It's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. And like you said, Dutton said he'll listen to scientists. Well, I guess he needs to listen to our show. We've had plenty of scientists on our show.
Yep, you're welcome, Mr. Dutton.
Yeah. And, we can also point him out onto the reef to go for a snorkel or a dive.
I wonder if he's ever been for a scuba dive.
Yeah, I don't know. But
I wonder if any of them have actually been underwater and sat in front of the coral and had that connection feeling. I wonder if they've ever been diving. Maybe we should invite them out on a dive boat.
Yeah, well, it's an open invite. Let's put it out there. We're happy to take them and to take them to the Cairns Aquarium, any politicians that want to learn.
Yep.
And speaking of, politicians in general, I guess Albo's not off the hook either. We have seen the Labor Party wave through some new fossil fuel approvals over the past few years in a time when we can't afford to be investing in new fossil fuel projects. We should be allowing them to naturally attrition and investing. The new projects that we should be investing in should be renewable energy. But that's enough about the election for now. We've just been talking about, unfortunately, the coral bleaching that's currently happening on the Great Barrier Reef. So to explain a bit more about it, our guest today is the Australian Marine Conservation Society's Great Barrier Reef campaigner, Simon Miller. Now, because it is a public holiday today, I did pre-record Simon's comments yesterday. So if you want to text in a question for Simon, you won't be able to, but Brett and I are here live.
Yes.
And so if you have a question for us, you can text it in on this number, 0437 835 937. That number again, save it on your phone, just in case any questions pop into your head, 0437 835 937. Don't call us because we're busy talking on the radio, but you can text us and we'll do our best to answer it. But now let's hear from Simon. And the first thing I wanted to ask him was to tell us a bit about the Australian Marine Conservation Society and their amazing work.
Enjoy the chat.
The Australian Marine Conservation Society is Australia's foremost ocean-based charity. This year is actually our 60th year. So we've been campaigning for our oceans and working on all the threats that they face for 60 years now. So our work spans all of the special places in Australia, like the Great Barrier Reef, Ingaloo, our beautiful southern coast, and looks at things like marine parks, fisheries, climate change, ocean plastics, those sorts of things. I've been with AMCS for a number of years now and have been working in this space for 10 to 15 years. My work is primarily focused on sustainable fisheries, but I've also done work regarding climate change, marine parks, and a bunch of other marine issues throughout my career.
What's your response to the revelation that the reef is now experiencing its 6th mass coral bleaching event in 9 years?
Yeah, so this is truly devastating. I think we're becoming desensitized because of how often they've been occurring in recent years. But we really need to emphasize that these mass bleaching events aren't the norm, and until this last decade have occurred very rarely. And so it really is upsetting to hear that we're now in the midst of another mass bleaching event so hot on the heels of 2024, the summer of 2024, when we had what has been described as the most widespread and most severe mass bleaching event, which led to a lot of coral mortality. So lots of corals all across the Great Barrier Reef, but particularly in the south and the north, dying after that event. So what we're seeing at the moment is the reef just isn't getting that time to recover in between these mass bleaching events. And that's why this is so upsetting.
Let's dive into a little bit more detail. The reason we're aware of this being the 6th mass coral bleaching event in 9 years is because it was quietly dropped into the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park authorities emailed to their subscribers on Wednesday afternoon as part of their summer snapshot report. Can you please tell us a bit more about what the summer snapshot says in terms of the extent and severity of the bleaching that is happening on the Great Barrier Reef right now?
Yeah, so right now, this mass bleaching event is spanning from Townsville to the tip of Cape York. So that's about 1,300 kilometers. So it's over a really huge area. Now, in the summer snapshot, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority notes that around 41% of inshore and mid-shelf reefs that were surveyed from an aeroplane observed signs of medium to high bleaching. And what that means is between 30 and 90% of the corals on each of those individual reefs were showing signs of coral bleaching. Now, when you actually look at some of the data and some of the maps provided in that summer snapshot, it's very clear that the reefs north of Cooktown in particular, so from Cooktown to the Torres Strait, are those that have been most heavily affected. So those inshore reefs in that region, the vast majority have got high bleaching, medium high or very high levels of coral bleaching. And that's not a surprise because we've seen heat build in that part of the ocean since December, since late last year. So we've had 4 months of far above average temperatures building in the northern Great Barrier Reef. And it's that heat stress that are causing these corals to bleach. And so we're really worried about the impact that's going to have on corals on the far northern Great Barrier Reef, and we're likely to see pretty significant mortality from this. But that bleaching, as I said, has also stretched down past Cairns, so there's some significant bleaching occurring in the Cairns region, and has extended all the way down to Townsville. And what's concerning here is this isn't just unique to the Great Barrier Reef. For the first time on record, we're seeing bleaching occurring on both the Great Barrier Reef as well as Australia's other World Heritage listed coral reef over at Ningaloo in Western Australia. And they've had a really severe bleaching event during the summer over there as well. And so to have this occurring on our 2 major coral reefs at the same time is really alarming and really shows the impact that the climate crisis is having in Australia. But again, it's not just limited to Australia. We're seeing this around the world, and this is the real-time impacts of climate change. As heat is building around the world and our oceans are absorbing that heat, we're in the midst of a global coral bleaching event. And that's been going on for more than a year now. So we've seen reefs in Florida, reefs in the Caribbean, as well as in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, that are really suffering from a lot of heat stress and have suffered from a lot of coral mortality there too.
When people find out all of that information, which you've just explained, it's a lot to take on, and an understandable first reaction of a lot of people is it possible that this is all just part of a natural cycle?
Unfortunately, I think a lot of us wish it wasn't true, but this isn't normal to be seeing bleaching events, mass bleaching events like this, and the level of coral mortality that we saw last year. It's still too early to tell how much coral mortality, how many corals would die from this mass bleaching event that's still unfolding at the moment. But this isn't normal. This isn't natural. This is driven by human-induced climate change. And that is what is causing this phenomenal heat stress that is building. And it's happening almost on an annual basis now. And when it happens that frequently, the Great Barrier Reef just doesn't have that time to recover. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still a very resilient system and it's very varied. It spans such a huge area along our coastline. Each individual reef will respond to this differently. And so that it's still a very beautiful system. Yeah. Still an incredible system, but its resilience is what's being impacted by these back-to-back constant stresses that's occurring from climate change.
A lot of people have noted that corals regrew quite quickly after previous bleaching events, but I understand that regrowth was dominated by a small number of species. So how do you think these repeated bleaching events are changing the biodiversity of the reef?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the main concerns of scientists and those of us that work in this space. It's how is the system changing over time? it does have that remarkable capacity to recover from these events, but it needs time. And we are seeing slow changes in the system, in the ecosystem, but we're worried that we might approach a threshold where those changes become much more rapid as the world continues to warm. And so we have seen in recent years, so a few years ago, we had 2 or 3 years where we didn't have as much heat building up over the Great Barrier Reef. We didn't have these mass bleaching events. And that period of fairly neutral conditions did provide a window for recovery. And so the fast-growing corals, as you say, a small number of species of fast-growing corals can recover quite quickly there. But there's hundreds of species of corals on the Great Barrier Reef. There's huge amounts of diversity. And some of the other species of coral can take hundreds of years to form the sorts of sizes of coral bommies and things that you might see while you're out snorkeling or diving or spending time out on the water. And if you're losing these corals from climate change and from mass bleaching events that have lived for 400 years, that's a real disaster when you're losing something as ancient and special as that.
As well as the heat waves and coral bleaching impacts, climate change is also making other extreme weather events more severe, such as flooding. Can you tell us a bit more about how flooding is impacting the reef?
Yeah, so this is one of the other concerns here, right? So it's not just the impact of heat that stresses corals. You also have the cumulative impacts of what we call these other disturbance events, things like floods and cyclones in particular. And we're seeing climate change turbocharge those events as well. And so obviously in the Cairns region last year, there was Cyclone Jasper, a huge cyclone that dumped a phenomenal amount of rain on Cairns. And after that, we saw large amounts of sediment and pollutants like nitrogen being washed off the land. And when you get all that sediment and outflows out onto the reef, and it can travel quite a long distance out of some of these river systems, that can smother these really important habitats like coral reefs and seagrasses that need light. They need light to be able to feed and to photosynthesize and survive. And so when you get these huge water outflows smothering corals and seagrasses, that can also lead to bleaching of coral or death. And so that was Jasper that hit Cairns last year. But then this year, we've also had some really significant rainfall events, some of the highest rainfall totals on record, in particular around Townsville and the Burdekin. And that water traveled more than 100 kilometers offshore out of the Burdekin. So it's not just inshore reefs that are being affected, although they are, of course, the worst affected by these water flows. But in some cases, it's also making its way out to the outer reef and causing impacts out there.
The photos of white bleached corals have made their way into everyone's psyche, but some of the impacts from flooding are really devastating as well. Just a few things that have happened over the past few years. There's been reefs affected by Cyclone Jasper's flooding, where the giant clams just died from the excess of flood water that was poured out onto them. And these giant clams that were like a meter long, probably more than 50 years old, just died, and the dead part of the flesh of the clam just washed up on the beaches. And we also saw thousands of dead tropical fish like parrotfish and so on washing up on the beaches of the Daintree after Cyclone Jasper. And I also have read studies about the link between declining dugong numbers and flooding in seagrass areas. Do you know anything about the impact of floods on some of those beloved species like turtles and dugongs that need those seagrasses to survive?
Yeah, that's right. So the main source for dugongs is seagrass. And so that makes up a huge proportion of their diet. And when seagrass is smothered in sediment, and when you have these really basically muddy waters sitting over seagrass for long periods of time, that can kill off seagrass. And so we have seen that over the years, these really significant flood events really killing off large areas of seagrass that dugongs depend on to survive. And so when dugongs aren't eating enough, that obviously impacts their health. And so quite often after major flood events, particularly widespread flood events, you'll see an increase in dugong strandings, where sick or dead dugongs are washing up on shore. They might also delay their breeding, which means they won't be having their calves that year. And for a dugong that's already slow to breed, the fact that they might skip breeding cycles for a year or two can have an impact on their populations too. Now, the thing that should be noted about dugongs is they do also have a capacity to migrate as well. And so when those flood events are quite localized and maybe not stretching over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, dugongs do have the capacity to move. And so they will move to other regions with healthier seagrass populations. And we've also seen that in the past as well.
I want to move back to something you touched on before, which is about how big the reef is and how much there is still left to see. Is there still hope for the Great Barrier Reef?
Yeah, there's definitely still hope. So, I mean, the reef, as I mentioned before, it is naturally a resilient ecosystem, and it still is an incredible ecosystem. We're so lucky to have it on our doorstep here, to be able to go out and see it. And it's not just a national treasure, it's an international treasure, and something that we are custodians of, that we need to be doing everything that we can to protect it. Now, there is still hope, but what we really need is action. And this is primarily action on climate change, and that's a global action on climate change. But Australia needs to show some leadership and take action on climate change. And that's real action to decarbonise our economy rapidly to give the Great Barrier Reef a fighting chance. But it's also tackling some of those local threats like water pollution and unsustainable fishing. And so you need to do those things to have that hope for coral reefs. But it's really important to note that the window is closing. Like, a lot of people that work in this space and a lot of scientists have often looked at the 2020s as being the critical decade to save the Great Barrier Reef and to take action to save coral reefs globally. I mean, we're already halfway through, we're past halfway in this decade. So the urgency to take action to save coral reefs as we know and love them, it needs to be done now.
You're hearing from Simon Miller, Great Barrier Reef campaigner from the Australian Marine Conservation Society, talking about the Great Barrier Reef, which is currently just coming out of its 6th mass coral bleaching event in just 9 years. And the next thing I wanted to talk to him about was the upcoming federal election. I asked him what key policies or commitments are the most urgently needed to protect the reef.
The main threat to the Great Barrier Reef and to coral reefs globally is climate change. And so that is the most pressing action that needs to be taken. And so it's all well and good having all the great monitoring that occurs on the Great Barrier Reef. So we get a lot of this data, and that's fantastic, but we do need action. And so what we need basically is reef-safe climate policies. And that means slashing our carbon emissions and fully decarbonising our economy. And so that's cutting climate pollution by 90% by 2035 and stopping those approvals for new fossil fuel projects. That is the most urgent action that needs to be taken. And at the moment, climate change isn't really getting a look in political discourse in the run-up to this election. So I think making sure that the major parties putting forward policies that tackle climate change and really deal with this issue, show leadership on climate change to transition our economy and make sure that we're doing everything that we can to protect the reef. So that's the longer term action that needs to take place. In the short term, there's other things that we can do to build reef resilience. And I touched on those just before. So this is primarily taking action on water pollution and unsustainable fisheries. One thing that is lacking for the Great Barrier Reef is something like an emergency response plan. So at the moment, when these events occur, mass bleaching events and things like that, we have to wait until the end of the summer, like now, to find out what the impact has been. We don't treat them like other major environmental disasters, things like bushfires. They're very similar events. You could describe a mass bleaching event as an underwater bushfire. And so when those events occur on land, we obviously respond instantly, but there's no instant response when it comes to a mass bleaching event. So what an emergency response plan could do is set trigger levels For example, 8-degree heating weeks. So this is when you have 8 weeks of 1 degree above summer maximum temperatures as a bleaching threshold. So 8-degree heating weeks is normally the stage where you start to see really serious bleaching occurring and can lead to the death of some of the less resilient species of coral, which are often those fast-growing ones. So you could set triggers around that level that when you hit them, you take actions that protect those reefs that are suffering. And so some of those actions could be linked to fishing, they could be linked to water quality, they could be linked to the cruise industry and not dumping effluent and things like this. And so what you're essentially trying to do with this emergency response plan is really protect these coral reefs that are suffering from coral bleaching. And I think it's also important to note that not every coral reef is created equally. There's certainly some coral reefs that when you look to the future are probably more important than others. So they're reefs that, because of ocean currents, might be more protected from these warmer waters. They might have upwelling of cooler waters that protect them from these ocean heat masses. And you also have reefs that are really important for basically the replenishment of other reefs. So because of ocean currents, they carry off the coral larvae to reseed other reefs. And so what you can do is you could probably prioritize some of these reefs for how important they are into the future and make sure that they have these higher levels of protection when a serious event like this is unfolding.
Wow, I really love that idea. Have you had much response from any leaders in that sort of emergency response plan? I think it would be a fabulous idea.
Yeah, so it's a relatively new concept. It's something that is being discussed at both levels of government and something that we have put forward as a concept that should be developed. At the moment, we're still waiting to see, in the context of this election, if there will be any further policy announcements around the Great Barrier Reef and what more can be done in the short and long term to help protect the reef and increase its resilience.
Okay, I just want to address some frequently asked questions that I often get from people, just to sort of be a devil's advocate here. Why should Australia take responsibility for climate change in our upcoming election when other countries are burning fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, we're one of the largest contributors when you take into account the mining and the burning of the fossil fuels that come out of Australia, particularly when you look at that on a per capita basis. And so when you do have a national treasure and a global treasure like the Great Barrier Reef and Ningaloo on the West Coast on our doorstep, we're custodians of these incredible natural assets with huge biodiversity. And anyone that's been out on the reef knows what an incredible place it is.
Mm.
We're custodians of these places. And so we need to be showing the leadership that we can tackle the threat of climate change and do everything that we can to protect these natural assets. And that gives us that influence on the global stage to help other economies transition alongside us, because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take all of the world's economies transitioning to low carbon and net zero economies to save the Great Barrier Reef. So I think that's one of the most important things that we can do.
Absolutely. And as I understand it, Australia isn't on track with our Paris Agreement targets to do our part in the world as part of that global community to limit our carbon emissions, and other countries are soaring ahead of us in terms of that action, which means that there's a lot more that we could be doing, which is good news in a way. It means that we can do more to act on climate change and protect the reef, and that's my sense of it. Another devil's advocate question: why should everyday Australians care about this bleaching event on the reef when it appears that the biggest issues everyone's facing in the lead up to this election are very much cost of living, I feel?
Of course, and cost of living and many of the other issues that are a focus in this election are, of course, important issues that need to be addressed by the next Australian government. But we shouldn't normalise what is happening on the Great Barrier Reef and become numb to the news that the Great Barrier Reef and corals are bleaching and dying year after year. As I've said a few times, the Great Barrier Reef is an incredible place. and something that we should all treasure and be proud of. And so we need to do everything that we can to save it. But we should also know that it's an incredibly important part of the Queensland economy, $6 billion industry. There's 64,000 tourism jobs that rely on a healthy, thriving Great Barrier Reef. And so that's why we need to be taking action. That's why every Australian should care about the Great Barrier Reef, and every Australian should do everything they can to get out and see the Great Barrier Reef, because it is still an incredible place as well.
Absolutely. And polls consistently show that Australians do care deeply about the Great Barrier Reef, and it is a major issue that they would like to see the government act more on. So it's definitely something that we'd all like to see all the candidates for the upcoming election paying attention to. And speaking of that, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese recently travelled to Cairns just last week and visited the Great Barrier Reef to announce $10 million in funding for education programs for students to visit the reef. Is that sort of thing going to be enough to help protect the reef?
So look, it's great that there is that funding, particularly if it's directed to students in schools that probably don't have the financial capacity or are located in regional and rural areas. It's great that they'll have that opportunity to get out and see the Great Barrier Reef firsthand, to learn about it and learn to love it and want to protect it into the future. So that's a very worthy program. But ultimately, it's going to need a lot more than that if we want to be showing that leadership that we've talked about and really putting our best foot forward to save the Great Barrier Reef and do everything we can to boost its resilience. So that's where we're really looking for the next Australian government to show leadership and to step up and really go forward with some strong climate policies that will decarbonise our economy rapidly, that will deal with the local threats to the Great Barrier Reef, things like cutting water pollution rapidly and dealing with unsustainable fishing that's occurring on the Great Barrier Reef. These are the kind of investments that we need to see if we really want to be protecting the Great Barrier Reef.
It's been asserted that Australia's next government may be the Great Barrier Reef's last chance, quote unquote, in a Guardian article recently. But recent scorecard analyses by the Climate Council and the Australian Conservation Foundation have found that not all parties have a plan to cut carbon pollution or switch to renewables. And also, after the Queensland election late last year, we've recently transitioned to an LNP government in Queensland. And last week they announced that they are going to look at weakening their climate targets for Queensland, extending the life of coal-fired power and building new gas-fired power stations. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means for the Great Barrier Reef?
Yeah, so while we talk about taking climate action, one of the most important things we need to see is the urgency. So all of the major parties have got commitments to net zero by 2050, but we can't wait till 2045 or something like that until we really start accelerating our climate action. We need to do the bulk of the heavy lifting now. And as I touched on before, we've often said that the 2020s, this decade, is the decade to save the Great Barrier Reef. So we need to be front loading those efforts to cut climate pollution. And so when you hear about a potential threat to and reviews of emissions reduction targets in Queensland, which are strong emission reduction targets that would go a long way towards helping the Great Barrier Reef, that's not the kind of action we need to be seeing. We need to be seeing strengthening of climate targets, particularly at a federal level. And so we need to see that happen in this next term of government. Now, whether it's the last chance, I'm not sure, but we certainly need that urgent action right now in this next term of government with ambitious climate targets. And so, as I said, that means cutting climate pollution by 90% by 2035. So you're front loading those emissions reductions and also ensuring that there's no new approvals of fossil fuel projects, which we've seen too many of in this current term of government.
Absolutely. We can't just keep kicking the can down the road to the next election and the next election when we have such frequent bleachings happening on the Great Barrier Reef. It is crunch time. So thanks very much for your time today, Simon. I think I'll just do one last question. Have you got any final message for all the listeners, all Australians, all Cairns locals who have got a really important job to do in the next couple of weeks. We've got early voting opening next Tuesday and the election day is on Saturday, the 3rd of May. So in reflection that we now are in the 6th mass coral bleaching event in 9 years on the Great Barrier Reef, what would be your parting message?
What we're seeing on the Great Barrier Reef at the moment is not normal. And we need to take some urgent action to do something about it if we want to maintain this incredible ecosystem that we've got on our doorstep. And so when it comes to your vote in the election, do keep the reef and climate action at the forefront of your mind. And so take a good look at what the different parties are proposing. Consider following some of the leading conservation organisations like the Australian Marine Conservation Society, like WWF Australia, the Australian Conservation Foundation. Consider following them on social media and looking at some of their communications materials, because I know different organisations do have things like scorecards and things like that that are definitely worth a look, and to consider those things that you value when you come to vote. So vote for the reef in this coming election, and let's hope that the major parties put forward some policies that will safeguard our Great Barrier Reef.
Vote for the reef. Perfect message to finish off with. Simon Miller, Great Barrier Reef campaigner from the Australian Marine Conservation Society. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks, Tanya.
If you've just tuned in, we've been talking about the coral bleaching event that's unfortunately happening on the Great Barrier Reef right now. And we heard from the Australian Marine Conservation Society's Great Barrier Reef campaigner, Simon Miller. So, Brett, it's the school holidays.
Yes.
You've been absolutely flat chat in your job as the education manager at the Cairns Aquarium. How busy has it been with Australian holidaymakers?
Oh, well, in a good way. It's been so busy. It's been really, really good. So we're getting lots of visitors from down south. International guests are back. So it ranges from the little people to our elderly folk. We're getting everybody. But yeah, it's been amazingly busy.
Yeah, so I think you speak to more than 1,000 people per day when it's...
Oh, yeah, minimum.
Yeah. And they're listening to your educational talks about what's happening on the reef. So what sorts of questions and comments are you getting from people about what's happening on the reef at the moment?
Well, it's been actually really positive. Positive in a way that people want to know. You know, the elections come up a lot, and once the people have listened to our shows and we give them the actual reason as to why it's happening and the cause and effect, then we're getting a wide range of questions. A lot of our senior guests are coming up to me and they say, thank you for giving us the real story, or they're saying, look, we snorkeled up here 50 years ago and we're thinking of going out again. Are we going to see what we saw back then? And it's quite difficult to say to them, look, probably not, you know, but...
it's still amazing though.
It's still gorgeous. Look, we always encourage people to go out there and visit our beautiful animals, but yeah, we're getting a very varied questions at the moment for sure.
Yeah, so it's definitely on people's radar ahead of the election.
Yeah, definitely.
And so what have you been telling people when they ask what's currently happening on the reef, and what's their reaction? Yeah,
so it's usually we do a number of shows. So we do a deep reef show where we talk about our local reefs, and I have a hold onto a piece of coral and I pass it around to over 100 people to have a look at so they can see a
dead coral.
That's right. Unfortunately, one that's no longer with us, but they can have a really detailed look at it. And then we do a coral sea show at the end where we can talk a little bit more in depth about the coral sea. But usually people are just focused on the disaster that's happening out there with coral bleaching, which is just awful. But it's also important to allow people to understand the flow-on effect from that. So if someone has a full love for turtles, I mean, who wouldn't? I do, of all marine life, you've got to remember that it's not just our poor corals that are suffering from this. It's the flow-on effect from that. All of the other animals that call that home. And I think that's the sad part about it. And it's the connection also between what's happening on the reef to the oldest rainforest on planet Earth, which is the Daintree rainforest. You know, is 80 million years older than the Amazon. So the EAC is the puppet master of the rainforest and the reef. And if our corals in our reef are suffering, it doesn't just affect that. It affects the rainforest because it affects the weather. It's and when you put all that into a big package for them, it's a lot of information for someone who doesn't really know a lot about it to start with, which is why they come to us. But usually they look at you and go, thank you so much for giving us the real story, just telling it how it is.
Yeah, well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I loved how you said that, you were getting questions from kids about what they can do, and especially in the lead up to the election. What was that comment you were telling me about the fish? What's his name again?
Oh, Chang.
Yeah.
yeah. Big Chang. He's been giving people the side eye, as the kids say, this week, and the people the side eye to try and direct them in the right direction with the next election to make sure that we vote on behalf of this seventh natural wonder that we have out off our coast and our beautiful rainforest as well. So we need to be their voice. There's never been a more important election to help protect our beautiful Great Barrier Reef and this environment that we have in this country. It's so important. It
is absolutely so important, and unfortunately, that's all we have time for on today's show.
It's gone quick again.
Yes, but we'll be back next week. Thanks to all of our listeners for joining us on Word on the Reef. I'm Tanya Murphy and my co-host is Brett Goodban.
Yeah, happy Easter, everyone. Have an excellent Easter. Oh, it's terrible.
And if you came in late and you want to catch up on what you missed of this show or any of our other shows, you can listen back online. Just search for Word on the Reef on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at instagram.com/Word on the Reef podcast. And of course, be sure to tune in to Cairns FM 89.1 every Friday at 10 a.m. We're here, even on a public holiday today. We'll be here next week on the public holiday next Friday. So tune in to listen to the show live and text in your questions. That's all for this week. Best fishes.
Happy Easter.
See you next time.
Bye.